Software security today. We have Eva Black, independent, but years of work with US Gov, driving things forward there. We have Mike Bursell, the Executive Director of the Confidential Computing Consortium and fervent data privacy advocate. We have Mr. Nelson Batsford, who is a sales engineer at SUSE, and Divya Mohan, a principal technology advocate at SUSE as well. And we look forward very much to hear what you have to say. A round of applause for them, please.
And we're going to get started. This is a tall order to, begin with, because any session after lunch is very nap-inducing for me. Hopefully it's not for the rest of y'all, and we'll try and keep this as engaging as possible. But before we kick off, do y'all want to give a bit of context as to where your backgrounds are? Are y'all satisfied with the way Andrew introduced y'all?
Okay, put a mic in my hand to see how long I talk. Started doing stuff around open source in '99 and tried not to be associated with being a hacker back then. Definitely did work on fun things along the way, like distributed peer-to-peer networking, remote hardware management, large-scale compute for research, and then somehow the White House asked me to come and do some work there. And so I led a bunch of work at CISA for the past 2 years, and now I'm here.
Hi, I'm Mike Bursell. I've been doing cybersecurity, well, wasn't called cybersecurity when I started, for at least 25 years, which is a very long time, and open source for about the same amount of time as well. I have done sort of startup-y things, been Red Hat, Intel, Citrix, all those sort of things, and startups. And most recently, I've been involved with, and I'm currently leading the Confidential Computing Consortium, which is part of the Linux Foundation, but also co-chairing the work that the LF is doing via OpenSSF around the EU CRA, Cyber Resilience Act, about which there is a talk at, I think, 2:50. Looks very interesting.
Good plug. I'm Nelson. Introduced as a sales engineer, but I'm actually a cloud native specialist at SUSE, so my title's slightly changed. I'm here to talk about what we are doing as SUSE around open source security and software. The reason that I'm supposedly qualified to talk here is because I've been assisting enterprises actually implement security and software for cloud native infrastructures in the UK. So I've had various conversations with platform engineers as well as executives on actually how these things are put into place.
Actual people.
Real life people. Wow. Yeah.
That's a miracle given that, we have a lot of AI bots here. So, yeah, sure. And I am Divya Mohan, and Andrew introduced me perfectly. That's my current job title. Hasn't changed this year. So I also do a bunch of stuff outside of my job role in the open source ecosystem. I'm a maintainer for Kubernetes and do a bunch of stuff in the Chaos and the WebAssembly ecosystem. And today we're here to talk about security, especially open source security. And given how it has become, or rather how it has transformed from being just an afterthought to sort of, progressing left and shifting left and gaining its rightful prominence slightly. However, we still do have a long way to go. And we're going to sort of, have questions, to all of these folks, wonderful folks here. But hopefully, we do have some time at the end of the session to pass the mic on to you all and have you all ask the questions as well. So my first question to kick us off really would be around how, in the light of all these recent vulnerabilities, such as backdoor injections and script injection vulnerabilities, how do you think the security landscape has sort of evolved in the last couple of years, and how have maintainers struggled and probably successfully kept up with maintaining the security of their upstream code and ensure that it actually stays secure over days, months, and hours?
Okay, I'll start. There is no secure. I don't think anyone can say it is secure and stays secure. But I think people are paying more attention. There's assumption kind of in the question that all maintainers of open source projects are thinking about security, and I'm sure they're not. But I really do think that that has improved over the last 3 to 5 years. I think people are much more aware of it, and that's partly due to, some very obvious things that have been going on, partly down to some things that CISA and other folks have done, and in the EU and elsewhere in the world as well. So I think people are paying more attention. I think there are some frameworks people can use. The OpenSSF works quite hard on that, and there are other folks as well. But the thing we've got to keep doing is make it hard to do the wrong thing and easy to do the right thing. And the more we can put into our tools and our coding and our processes to encourage that, I think it'll just become the thing that you do more and more. We'll never get it perfectly right, but that's my hope.
Yeah. I suppose, just to follow on from that one, for a lot of people who are embarking on a journey into open source software or even just development as a whole, you are mainly thinking about the new shiny thing, right? And security has always been an afterthought and often takes days or weeks to implement something that you are very proud of and can be very quickly wiped away on release day when suddenly a day zero vulnerability comes along and that CVE number comes up and all of a sudden you're back to the starting point. So obviously with the evolution of cloud-native technologies and the ability to package up images and modules and things like that and easily distribute it, one of the really key things that I'm seeing in the industry is people using trusted sources for these packages and images that are included earlier on in the development cycle instead of people compiling them themselves. So that's really key, right? Because obviously the worst thing that you have is when on release day you do it with a scanner and then all of a sudden this package that you've got has got about 100 vulnerabilities in and you have to go straight back to the beginning.
I hope folks would run the scanner before release day. But I think there's a lot of complexity and overlaid terminology here between vulnerabilities and malicious code or package injections, best practices and bad practices. So I do want to point out that I don't think there is yet an established singular best practice because open source is so broad, it is so diverse. There's projects with one maintainer and with 1,000 maintainers. And they're signed in different ways, they're built in different ways, so best practices are subjective. What is most important to building security as a consumer of open source integrating it into a product is to understand the code and all of the dependencies that your application depends on. So there's been an emergence of new tools or new standards, new processes to analyze and study those dependencies and observe them to see when things change. Maybe there's a typo squatting attack on a hosting provider, and if you had tools in place to spot that in time, it wouldn't hit you on release day. Maybe there's a maintainer who just wins the lottery and walks away and forgets to update the DNS, and then the package source gets taken over. If you were monitoring those things, and most projects don't monitor the DNS for their dependencies, but that's happened. There's a lot of that detail. So there's not a single best practice, but there are some well-established bad practices, which we did publish just a month ago.
Yeah, and just to carry on that, and the thing about best practices, as I'd say they're contextual, is one way of looking at it. And one of those contexts is time. So just because we have a best practice now doesn't mean that's going to be the best practice in a day, a month, a year's time. So Intel, they use the phrase best known practice, which I kind of like because it just makes the point that this is where we are at the moment and there may be better things in the future.
Yeah, and I think Amanda in her keynote in the morning, if you'll attended, she did touch upon, bills of materials, software bill of materials to be specific as one of the, practices that are there to ensure that, the security of the supply chain in open source is sort of maintained. But are they truly the answer? S-bombs, C-bombs, H-bombs, whatever letter / bombs, are they truly the answer?
Oh, that's a spicy one for me. if folks have met Dr. Esbaum, he used to work together. SBOMs, I think, really do solve some problems, but they're not a panacea. They should be understood in context. It's sort of like the ingredient list. You can find out if you're allergic to it, but until SBOMs have more detail and more depth, they're very limited in their usefulness. What I like to suggest we work towards as a community, and would take everyone in open source, is supply chain transparency, using technology that we already have, like is the basis for Git, the Git DAG. It gives us cryptographic trail of all the commits in a project. One can do the same thing for all the components in a build. There's a number of different open source projects that already do this, whether it's around reproducible build or simply just tracing where your dependencies came from. I think that is the next sort of frontier, I guess, in trying to be able to respond when a zero-day drops or when an XZ style thing is discovered, and everyone has to ask, is this in my build? How do you find out?
So just to translate, that's XZ. For everyone who needs to know that. Yeah, and I would say SBOMs are probably, or equivalent, are necessary but not sufficient. We need more stuff as well. And the other thing is that, like many tools, that if you believe the hype too much, that can actually be bad. It can mislead you in thinking, I've sorted this, I know where we are, and let your guard down. And so over-reliance on any particular thing like this, it can be dangerous in itself.
I suppose seeing people implementing this stuff in the enterprise currently, for most organisations, at least in the UK, until there is compliance around SBOMs, it's kind of viewed as just extra paperwork for businesses to be able to actually implement. But saying that, I'm also of the opinion that as maintainers and creators of open source projects and software, having SBOMs at the beginning enables ease of access to technology and increases adoption from it at the beginning. When these compliances do come in, and they will come in because the EU will regulate it, and then every company will have to do it, and by extension the UK, I guess, people need this stuff. And obviously, the last thing that we want within the enterprise is to suddenly having to hotfix everything and deep dive into all the packages that are available. So improving ease of access to this software is really, really key.
Can I ask? Okay, just a question for you, really. How much of a pain is it seen to be at the moment? Is it seen to be as of little or no use, or preparatory, or how do people feel about it when they say SBOMs, SBOM, or SBOM, okay?
I suppose right now it's just a nice to have, right? It's purely just as a mitigation piece later on down the line, for businesses specifically. Yeah. I'm not having many customers come to me and saying, we require SBOMs for every single piece of software that you've got in your stack. Yep. That's not happening right now. But if you do say you've got it, they're like, okay, I feel a little bit safer. It's more of a warm feeling rather than a everything's hit the fan feeling. So.
There you go.
So artifact dependency graphs, there's been a bunch of work on them. I think I would love to see more folks getting involved in that edge, because if you have an SBOM, it is necessary but insufficient. If you have an artifact dependency graph, it is sufficient also to reproduce your SBOM and do other things.
Right, and actually, you pretty much answered my next question here about, some of the trends that you're seeing when integrating these frameworks, because are they actually useful to, enterprises or customers who are trying to integrate SBOMs or even like these artifact dependency graphs? Is there any interest at all? Is the most important question. Are people actually asking for it? And you pretty much answered that, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could just expand it a little bit. In the UK, I mean, obviously financial services are the most heavily regulated industry of them all, right? Especially as they're, even in the UK, they're susceptible to both EU regulation as well as whatever comes from the UK government. So, yes, right now it is paperwork, but they know that it's coming. I mean, DORA, for example, right? The need for multi-vendor, multi-cloud infrastructure to be able to mitigate risk comes with understanding what your infrastructure is made out of in the first place. So it's useful and good to have, especially when you need to adopt a multi-vendor approach, means multi-software, and obviously it also means open source components at the heart of it. So.
And now, because you mentioned the regulatory aspect, I have to start grilling the left side of the panel, I guess, about all things regulatory. You've worked with CISA, and I know you work with a lot of people that are involved in regulatory legal stuff. But we're seeing a lot of folks double down on security and safety of the supply chain, not just within the EU. There's directives all across the world, but specific to CRA and the work or the executive order rather, that I think was published a month back, 16 January. What are some of the expected ways that we can see this landscape evolve in the future, and how has it evolved over the last couple of years, given the context of supply chain security?
Oh, okay. So I think the first thing I'd say is GDPR has made people think about security in new ways, and that's, I think, a good thing. In terms of the EU CRA, which is where I think that I feel best qualified to talk about, that was signed into law December last year, so very, very recently. And it basically is going to apply to anybody who is producing anything commercial that's a product in the EU. And people are seeing it as a big threat. We shouldn't. We should think of it as we have for years been not doing enough around cybersecurity, and if we look at this right, hopefully this will raise the boat, raise the water, raise all the boats basically for everybody, because everyone will have to do more security. And it does a number of good things. Firstly, it says for any product you have to have done a risk assessment. People just don't do that, and if you've got to start that, you've got to document it. Then it says you've got to be, providing documentation. Sometimes, depending on what it is, you're going to be doing the conformity assessment, i.e. ticking all the boxes yourself. Sometimes you're going to need to send it to someone else who's going to do it, and that's all fine. But you've got to have the documentation about that, which will include things like SBOM specifically. And, if we think about supply chain and the long tail, there are regulations about vulnerability management and incident management, and you have to provide free upgrades for free updates for any security vulnerabilities. It's the law, and that's just going to change, hopefully, how we think about things a lot. It's what we should be doing anyway. And the place of open source is quite complex in this context. If you're interested, come and talk to me later on. But at least the EU has noticed open source and is treating the community and the ecosystem sensibly, even if we need to carry on doing a bit of tweaking as it all comes into force.
Overall, I think a lot of these activities, whether it's US or EU, is focused on or trying to shift the burden away from volunteers and onto those vendors or stewards or other entities who can shoulder the burden of maintaining the quality of open source libraries and projects that so much depends on. Right? Governments have noticed, have really come around to the understanding over the past 15 years, and Heartbleed probably was the first wake-up call, and then Log4j and XZ and other things, to just how much of our modern world depends on open source. Even if you're buying a product off the shelf, using a cloud service, your phone, your car. One of my moments of realization for me was how many open source components are in a modern car.
Yep.
It's a lot. Someone has to be responsible for that, and it shouldn't be a random volunteer somewhere in the world who doesn't know that their code is in a critical path in a car. That's what this is all about, shifting that responsibility and getting companies to start paying attention and start contributing and maintaining the code upon which their products depend for its full life cycle.
And sure.
I just want to say something about what we've been doing as SUSE for the open source community to be able to provide additional security. A while ago, SUSE acquired a company called Neuvector, and it's a security supply chain scanning tool. And at that point, when SUSE acquired this company, it was fully closed source, right? And as an open source company, we open sourced it and released it to the community. But by extension of that, it enabled developers within the open source community to implement secure policy and principle earlier on in the supply chain without having to require access to costly security programs and portfolio scanning tools. So what we've done is we've released, obviously, enterprise-grade scanning and security tool sets to everyone out there to be able to assist with these kinds of pieces. So you don't need to worry about having to learn best practices or dig it all out yourself. You can actually rely on the same tools that enterprises might be using, or even software vendors might be using at the same time.
And I think that's really important, that it's not just the big businesses we're caring about. And I think this is one of the things that the EU is very good at. It's good at looking at its citizens rather than just at businesses, and saying that everyone has a right to be protected, and their personal data and their livelihood and their personal safety. And therefore it is a responsibility of anyone selling a product to a person or an organisation to look after that as well. And I think that is a shift we're beginning to see as well, which is very welcome from my point of view.
Just one more shift to mention that I'm really excited to see governments actually getting involved in sustaining these investments in open source.
Yep.
So huge shout out to the folks at Sovereign Tech Agency for all their work. And I'll just mention a project that was being built in the US called HipCheck. A great little open source tool for doing some of the sort of subjective analyses we've all been discussing.
And I think I'd be remiss if I did not ask this question, because I think we have a full day of AI-related stuff tomorrow. So, given the proliferation of that term and the technology, and given how it's become so ubiquitous in aiding development of software, not just within open source, but even outside of it, what do you think would help us better account for the AI-generated code that's normally now being incorporated in the software that we use? I know that's a very tricky question to answer, but I wanted to ask that.
So I'm going to say there's one area where I believe that AI ML is really, really good, and that is for looking over things like logs and looking for false negatives, false positives, all those sorts of things in ways which humans are very bad at typically. And it's really revolutionized, I think, how security in that sort of state is done. Code worries me significantly. It's bad enough reading humans' code. I mean, I started off as a Perl coder, okay, so I really know about, read-only code. Once we have AI writing compiled bytecode or assembly code directly, our chances of finding that things there are horrible. And I think the chances of really clever people using AI, putting vulnerabilities in that we can't find, get worse and worse and worse. So that's kind of I'm worried. I'm not sure what to do about it, honestly. And I hopefully will be retiring before it's a major issue. So that's my main hope.
So retirement's the solution then?
Mike. And I'm going to, I guess, grab onto that concern about backdoors. And I was just at FileStem saying this over there too. If the training data for a model isn't open, then, and you've got a model, you're allowed to modify it, got to study it, but you don't know the training set, it's nearly impossible to find backdoors that have been injected in it. There's some great research out there on the topic of finding hidden backdoors, or rather injecting hidden backdoors based on data manipulation in training. So if you don't know it's there, you can't really find it. And if you do know it's there, but you don't have the data, it's really hard, next to impossible, to remove it. The best guidance for recurrent learning networks, reinforcement learning networks, which is often used for log analysis, right? They look at the log. If they don't find something but a human does, the human feeds that in, and the next checkpoint, the tool, the ML tool, is a little bit better. those sort of things. If bad data gets in and poisons the model, adding a potential backdoor or weakness, the only way to remove it is to roll back to a checkpoint,
Correct.
which you had to have the data to do. So you really need the training data for these models to be able to find and fix vulnerabilities in them. And if they're getting used for writing code or analyzing logs, and you don't have that autonomy or really good relationship with whoever's building it, there's another risk vector.
I think, I mean, going with obviously understanding AI, writing code at a deep level is also very important. But I suppose the biggest risk right now is thinking about it, how people are using it right now, right? Who here has used ChatGPT or Gemini to actually write code? Okay, and how many times? But this is it, right? That was about, I would say, about 50% of the room that have done that, right? And we're thinking about all the developers within mainly the UK or within the industry, all doing that right now. And if you've seen when you're using ChatGPT or Gemini to write code, it's including random packages, random modules to make it work, okay? So businesses want to use AI to write code because it increases velocity and keeps them competitive in the market, which is very, very important. So their developers keep up with that. So the combat is not just deep level AI writing assembly, but just people using it right now and just putting in random packages that introduce thousands of vulnerabilities or whenever, but they need to use it. So one of the main asks that we've had at SUSE is actually to put AI in our security tools, and that's to combat AI. I like to think of it as like Arnold versus T-1000. Just at the point of just AI versus AI to create security policy before or as soon as a risk is detected. Obviously, we have concepts of zero trust, and we have concepts of all these other pieces in there, but we need to think of security as a smarter level, and using AI, which is far quicker than anyone else, right, would probably be the best way to do it. But yes.
Ava has some burning questions.
And on the way, I'm just going to say a thing, which is I became aware of some really interesting work of AI combating AI based on something that Sal noted about honeypots. There's some really interesting work on AI being used in honeypots as defense and offense, which is worth looking into. Sal can give you more details.
So so many things I want to shake my head about. A lot of risks are introduced by using service-based AI or service-based LLMs like ChatGPT. When you input your data into it, it goes somewhere else. Who knows what they're doing with it? Or if you're using a service that's now training its models on everything that your company does, everything your employees do in that service. I think Slack was a pretty noticeable example when they turned that on. I don't know what's happened since then. It just caught my attention when they enabled it by default for a hot minute. There's a lot of risk of data exfiltration. There's a lot of additional risk of fake accounts, artificial accounts, platforms having artificial persons interacting with others. And then the broader sense of AI security, well, there's a lot of harms to society beyond just the tagline from an event I spoke at a few months back, stop hiring humans. That was the slogan of the conference. I didn't know that ahead of time. I think it was just their biggest sponsor. That's not a great message to send, that these things are going to fight each other and consume a lot of power and replace people. That's not how, they can do a lot of good. Log analysis is a really good example of that. There are many others. But being mindful and cautious of how one interacts with LLMs or other augmented systems and where your data is going in that process is also a big part of security, and not just open source.
And in the light of wanting to throw this out to the floor, I want to wrap this up here and ask each of you all, what are some of the things we must continue doing as members coming from different backgrounds, but all still working very much in the open source ecosystem? What's one thing we must continue doing, and what's one thing we probably should not absolutely do to improve the security posture and given the evolving landscape?
I think that obviously I mentioned it earlier around people's efforts to be able to release zero CVEs on day one of release. And I think that is extremely noble cause of them to do so. However, it consumes a lot of time and consumes, especially if you've got a small maintaining team or development team to do so, it consumes a ton of time to be able to get to that point, which could there be wasted later on when another CVE is detected. Obviously, there are vendors out there who dedicate entire teams to get projects to zero CVEs, and that is a fantastic thing to do to be able to make this software more consumable. However, it's trusting organizations to be able to implement, or if they are adopting open source technologies as a whole, they should be, and probably are, implementing tools to be able to secure this software within the runtime anyway. So the need to be able to get to zero CVEs is kind of wasted when these enterprises are always, or majority of enterprises are probably putting in tools to be able to mitigate that risk in the first place. So I think, it's an important piece, but maybe not the dual end-all, because it takes away from what you actually enjoy doing, which is making something really cool and actually be able to run the code in the first place.
Cool. So from my point of view, the first thing I want to say is think about securing your data in use. It's not just when it's on the network, it's not just when it's stored, it's when it's actually being processed. There are technologies out there called PETs which can help with this. But if you're going to be building an SBOM and you can't be sure that the system that was building that SBOM hasn't messed with that signature or what's in there, or whatever it is, why would you bother doing it in the first place? So think about that. And the second thing I would say is, when you're hiring or working with security people, make sure they don't all look like me. If we're going to beat the bad people, we need to have diversity of thought and background and ethnicity and sexuality and all of these things. It's one of the ways we may be able to beat the AIs, because actually the training data they use is actually often not very diverse. But we need that diversity in thinking and how we do stuff if we're going to make the most of the people who are going to make things as secure as possible. And I really, really want that message to go across.
Appreciate that comment, Mike. I think I've got more than just one thing.
Clearly, but
yeah.
One thing, specific
one
thing. Yes.
One thing. Really, it boils down to get involved upstream. And open source maintainers like myself have been saying this and beating this drum forever, but it's so much more important now. Most open source that is consumed commercially has just one or two maintainers. True. And they're volunteers. And that's not a great space to be if you don't own, if you don't have some part to play in the code that you're shipping. So start accounting for it in your COGS, your cost of goods sold. When you're doing your annual financial projections, account for the cost of understanding and analyzing all of your open source dependencies, the transitive ones too, and funding them, whether it's time of your employees or with money to a steward or a foundation. Really, really, your company's destiny depends on how well you help maintain the code you depend on in the commons. And a lot of the work around the CRA is trying to work towards that. A lot of the work that I was doing in the US was also trying to encourage more companies to do that. And that is part and parcel of avoiding bad practices. Don't consume open source that you could not help fix a vulnerability if one was found. Why would you do that to yourself? And really, Mike made a great point. A lot of the kinds of issues that emerge, the risks and threats that can emerge, will only be found by people who would recognize that as a risk themselves. Yep. You don't get that in your product development cycle if your teams are completely homogeneous. They'll only see one type of risk, or the types of risks that affect that demographic. We need diversity to be able to build resilient systems.
Yeah, so I mean, apart from like the technical and the regulatory stuff that you just said, the sociological aspect of it is equally important, because so far we are creating software and even AI to serve humans, not the other way around. So it's absolutely important we continue to have these conversations around helping improve the sustainability of the ecosystem in order to ensure that we have an ecosystem to talk about in the very first place. So with that, I think we're done here with our question and answer. We'd love to hear from y'all if y'all have any questions and answer them, potentially.
Please wait for the mic.
Yeah, there.
Thank you so much for the wonderful points. I just wanted to point out one of the discussions around the randomness of the open source packages that an AI might use when it's generating the code. So at least at our firm, what we did was that when we launched an AI-powered service, we specifically fine-tuned the model such that it only uses those type of open source packages that which we use internally within our product line, or which we expect to for external developers to use, such as like the SDKs, and such that like now the model will only use those particular packages in reference, which can perhaps help with better security. Because I know like we are also going to be having a panel tomorrow just specifically about zero trust security around AI. So I think like the conversation was really relevant, but would love to know from your perspective if you have also seen this kind of adoption, and if there are any takeaways for audiences who are probably implementing these AI systems for fine-tuning.
Yeah, so I suppose just to quickly clarify one of the points that I made, AI and GPTs and all these chatbots have turned almost everyone into a developer. So obviously, yes, 100%, we have tools and there are platforms in place that are being developed like yours that to be able to provide assistance to developers to be able to code something. However, there are thousands of developers within the UK who are just going into ChatGPT and saying, write me this little snippet, and then they just use that small, tiny piece in a larger project. And there are thousands of developers doing this right now because it's easy, right? So yes, 100% people are using more private AIs and more...
I would just ask if the goal of some sort of fine-tuning or local tuning is to help sort of enable very junior developers to code more quickly, more efficiently within some set of parameters, what guarantees that there will not be an accidental typo squatting included in the auto-generated script, that the junior developer won't know that that package is a copy of, with a bunch of artificially added GitHub stars, the real package with one little letter different in the name and some malicious injection. So there's a lot of risk introduced in using this tool to speed up people who are not part of the ecosystem. Because if you just look at a project that you don't know anything about the people, you don't know anything about it, you just look at it on GitHub or somewhere else, the presentation of it is very easy to be manipulated. More stars, more forks, that's all those sort of stats can easily be gamed.
I hate the phrase zero trust because it should be explicit trust, in my view. But the problem is you have to have explicit trust in that as well.
So, slightly different question for you. Do you think that the increased regulation in the space around, CRA, and I know that the EU is talking about mandating SBOMs, for instance, and other sort of quality aspects of open source, will these represent an economic imperative to actually improve open source maintainers?
I thought you were going to say for companies. There's an entity, a role called Open Source Stewards, which is introduced by the CRA, which is basically if as a maintainer you don't want to be held responsible if you don't have obligations on you, this is mainly aimed to have people like the foundations, like the Eclipse or the Apache or the Linux Foundation, so they can be providing some sort of support for these things. And but they have members who work with them to do that. So there's actually an opportunity to provide an economic incentive to allow that to happen. And I think actually the whole concept of open source stewards is actually pretty well thought out and does give us some interesting new economic incentives. It's not perfect, but there are some opportunities.
Yeah, Mike beat me to my point, but the idea of a steward has been evolving through dialogue between the European Commission members and open source communities and others for a couple years now. The details are still being worked out, so there's still room for the European standards bodies to define exactly what a steward is, what the responsibilities are, how it's measured, how that dialogue works. But my understanding is the goal very much, or explicitly, is to increase the engagement between companies that are using open source in their products and the stewards and the communities and volunteers who all work together, and to make that relationship more explicit and more mutual.
If anyone's interested, contact me or go to the OpenSSF Global Cyber Policy Group.
One last plug, go watch the recordings from FOSDEM. There was an entire dev room, a whole day of content with members of the European Commission. They are talking about this, actually more than just one day, several different tracks. There's tons of very recent, 2 days ago, discussion on that question.
And I suppose the point around enabling open source maintainers to be able to make it economically viable is really important, because what you want as a maintainer is adoption, right? Without people using your project, without people using your project, there's no, if you're in it for financial and economic gain, which a lot of people are, then you would probably want to be able to enable businesses to comply with your project, with your business to be able to actually use your project because it complies to compliance, right? So using SBOMs earlier on means that you have a higher chance to be compliant within CRA and other pieces out there.
We can happily have different viewpoints on that one.
Yeah, it's
There's a
fine.
spectrum of agreement. Let's carry on.
A diversity of thought is always appreciated. I think there's just, no room for questions. I'm sorry, Sal. But thank you so much for being a wonderful audience, and we'll catch you around here. Thank you.